Okay, we are live again. I am here with Emily Stone from mightier.com. Hopefully I'm showing up for you folks. If you could raise your hand or leave us a comment or like this if you can hear us, because this is our second attempt at this. Apparently you all couldn't hear the first one. So we'll wait till we get a couple of likes or comments telling us that they can hear us. If you can hear us, please raise your hand.
Looks like there's a few people in here at least.
Yeah. We have a few watchers. Nothing? You can't hear us? Oh, wait, there's...
I can hear you. It's good now. Great.
It's good now. Okay, great. Yay. Okay, then we will continue. Great. Thank you for letting us know. Okay, so yeah, we're back in business, and it derailed my train of thought a little bit. Totally. So Emily, why don't you introduce yourself again and tell us what Mightier does, since they didn't hear you the first time.
Absolutely. Okay, so yes, I'm Emily. I am happy to be here. Thanks everybody for hanging in there with some tech issues. I think that's just the reality of where we're at nowadays. So thanks for being flexible. So yes, I am a licensed independent clinical social worker here in Boston. I have experience working in a variety of settings, mostly in the Boston Public Schools. I am currently working for Mightier, which is a really, really fun and wonderful company where we focus on building emotional regulation skills through play. We're a biofeedback based platform, video game platform for kids that they can use in their homes. And so I have the great opportunity of helping kids to practice skills and build muscle memory, and the great job of talking to lots of parents and professionals who are looking to help kids. So happy to be here.
Okay, sounds great. And I encourage all of you to check it out. Just to review for those of you watching some of the standard stuff. If I disappear, that means my power went out. It's happened before. But Emily can stay on, and hopefully, like last time, I will come on after a few minutes. If you have to leave early, yes, this will be on the Facebook page forever. And I also then put the video on YouTube, and anything that Emily mentions or talks about today, any resources that get called out, and where to find her and contact her and all that, I send all of that out in an email after this. I post it on Facebook. It'll be posted in the group on the page. So it will all be there. If you have a question, you can feel free to leave us a comment and ask a question as we're chatting. What we wanted to talk about today is COVID-19, the pandemic, the shutdown, the isolation, the social isolation, and our kids. Before we get into that, I feel like we have to talk about, I don't want to call it the elephant in the room, but, you know, because people are talking about it, but there's a lot going on in our country today. And since your background is in trauma, a lot of our kids are witnessing trauma right now. And, you know, I certainly monitor what my 11-year-old watches on TV, but at the same time, watching that video of George Floyd was all but impossible to avoid. Even if you weren't watching the news, they would show a brief clip, you know, coming up at 6 or coming up at 11, you know, watch this, and they would show the clip. And, you know, what else can you say? That these kids are watching a murder, you know, happening on TV. So, and then they're watching riots, and they're watching their neighborhoods. And that's not even getting into those kids who actually live in those neighborhoods and those towns and those parts of town that are being destroyed. So what advice do you have for parents right now with all of this?
Absolutely. And I think I'm happy, one, that we're talking about this, because I think, like you said, it is an elephant in the room, but it's also like, it needs to be talked about, and it's part of our job as educators, as, you know, facilitators in the mental health field, as parents. I think it is such an important thing to talk about. So I think, I would love to kind of talk about trauma in a broad sense and tie this in, if that would feel okay for you, just around like how I'm picturing kind of the last 3 months. And I think these two things really blend well together, if that would feel okay.
I think they do, because, you know, we had the Armand Barbary thing happened, and then a few weeks later, you know, this other one happened. So I think, you know, and again, we have to talk about this. It keeps happening and it has to stop. So, absolutely. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, I think, I mean, so for me personally, my background is in a lot of trauma work. So I worked with kids in the Boston Public Schools for many years, where I did a lot of training and specific work around trauma and kind of this persistent and pervasive trauma cycle and this community-based trauma. And so I think a lot of my training, when I think about traumatic events and, COVID and the recent current events in the last couple of weeks, through a trauma lens, which I think in a lot of ways helps to bring me comfort and helps to bring parents comfort when we talk about it through this kind of educational and biological standpoint, because it helps us to realize, there's a lot that our brain and our body are reacting to that we have some control over, right? So even though there's a lot out in the world that we don't have a lot of control, there's a lot that we can control personally with our own bodies and the language that we use. And so when I'm thinking about trauma, the first thing I kind of think about, and especially over the past 3 months, is that, what's really being activated over and over right now is our sympathetic nervous system, right? So our sympathetic nervous system is really our flight, fight, and freeze response, right? So it is what gets triggered when there's danger. So if, my example is always, I was walking down the road on a jog the other day and my neighbor's dog came running out of the house and barked at me and scared me. And the next thing I knew, I was across the street, right? I don't remember how I got there, but my immediate response to my sympathetic nervous system took over and protected me, right? It had me flee a situation. And what we know for kids who are experiencing trauma, this system is constantly firing. And so for the past 3 months, adults and kids included, the sympathetic nervous system has had a really, really hard time turning off because we are constantly having news brought to our attention. The videos that you're responding to, school closures, different things closing, events getting canceled, and just constant news cycle that our sympathetic nervous system actually isn't turning off. And so what we see in that case is, a lot of this changes in mood, difficulty concentrating, a lot of this depression and anxiety coming out of this because we have a really hard time, turning that off. And there are ways that we can hack our sympathetic nervous system, but that's something that we're seeing, right, over and over. And I think, I don't know if it's helpful to I would love to kind of talk about ways to hack that.
Yeah, that would be, because you're right. And I think, myself and and I've seen some of my friends, and oh my gosh, it is getting so dark out there. I mean, notice how dark it is, in my, I was in a lit room and now I'm in the dark because it's really stormy.
Yeah, you're hiding.
It's not nighttime. It's really lunchtime here in Pennsylvania. But yeah, I mean, myself and my friends, we say, okay, we're going to take a screen break. I'm going to take a Facebook break, and we take off and we watch, fun stuff on TV and fun movies instead of being barraged with news. Yeah. But it seems like that's not enough. So what else, what can, I'm trying to walk, those dogs are getting walked so often,
Oh, yeah. I mean, our dogs are happier than ever, right?
Right.
They are people who are making out well right now. Yeah. I mean, and so in terms of just hacking our sympathetic nervous system, there's a few things that we know that are helpful. I think the number one thing, that when our sympathetic nervous system gets activated, right, the number one thing that happens is all of our blood rushes to our heart, right? So our heart is beating really, really quickly, and it's making our body be able to move quickly, make snap decisions. And so the advice that I always give that oftentimes, people kind of snuff, they're like, oh no, I try that and it doesn't work. Deep breathing is the number one thing that we can do to reset our sympathetic nervous system, right? To get our parasympathetic nervous system, which is the thing that counters our sympathetic nervous system. It's what actually gets it working, right? So taking slow, long, deep breaths is actually something that we can do to kind of hack our brain and make that actually work. That being said, it's hard to have kids take deep breaths, right? It's hard for me to take deep breaths. So thinking of really fun and creative ways to do that, I think, it's something that we do at My Dear all the time, but I think also things like breathe like a bear, sitting still like a frog. Those are all really awesome mindfulness books and resources that are helpful. But I also think, and I always say this to kids, that helping kids feel empowered over their brain and their body is something that's really helpful. So helping them to understand those nuances and maybe not using big words like sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, right? But helping kids to understand that this is a natural thing for our bodies to be feeling this way, right? Giving kids education and power over their bodies and having that awareness for them is so important and helps them to really, feel like they have some control over that. I mean, I think there's a lot of other things that we can do in terms of, making ourselves feel a lot of gratitude and things like that. But not sure if you want to hop around with topics, and happy to.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. And also, from like my son who he isn't great at, say, following directions. And if I say, take deep breaths or breathe with me, that's not going to happen. Like it's not in his skill set to be able to mimic that.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, so where I kind of start with skills too, is I think, yes, those are all wonderful things, but we know our kids and we know that's hard.
Right.
And I think, so my always go-to is just for helping kids manage this, right, is starting with ourselves, right? As adults, I think I always give the analogy of like when a plane is going down, right? They say, put on your oxygen mask before, you put on your kids. And I think we know that's important. And it sounds like you're doing a really good job with that, of just, saying, hey, I'm taking a break from media. I'm taking care of myself, and modeling that for kids is really, really important, because when we feel healthy and happy, that is when we, know that we're able to do that for our kids. And so I think starting there and making sure that you have resources and reach out for support and ways that you can connect socially. And, I think that is such an important piece. I really stick behind the education piece, right? Like, I think helping kids understand both these things, both the current events of COVID, as well as the protests and everything that's going on. I think education at a developmentally appropriate level is so important. I think we sit around for kids often and think, less is more, and that they don't know what's going on, right? And it's okay for them not to know. And oftentimes kids know a lot more than we think they do. And if we are assuming that they are, coming up with this information, we want to make sure it's accurate, right? We don't want them to be guessing. So one example that I heard from a kid recently was, he said that he thought that, he heard on the news and on commercials that COVID was specifically killing, elderly people. And so, he was 9. He said to me, he goes, but, Miss Emily, like, that means my grandma's going to die because she's elderly. And so it's really helping kids to understand, what those risk factors mean, what the actual facts are, having a space for them to ask questions, because ultimately, like, we're able to like get rid of that rumor, right? It's like, it's not all elderly people are dying. This is what we're doing to protect our grandmother, right? This is what we're doing. We're, and yes, there's a high risk and it's helping to understand, but that does not mean that every elderly person is going to die. So a lot of times kids make up things in their heads, and, we want to make sure that we're able to support them with some positive education and kind of dispelling those false rumors as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I know I asked my son, and we actually were watching the news. Was it just 2 days ago? And I said to him, and he's 11, and I said, do you know, it's funny because the broadcaster actually said, oh, and it's important for us to be talking to our kids about this. So I'm like, hey, what better time than right now? So I said to him, do you understand why all this is happening? And he said, yeah, because of George Floyd. And it was, I had to explain to him, well, yes, but it's a lot, it's a lot more than George Floyd, that this has been going on for hundreds of years. Yeah. And, people are frustrated. So, and angry, and rightfully so.
And I think saying that it's okay that you don't know the answer sometimes, right? Like, I think our tendency is to go to, fact mode of like, well, this is why it's happening. And it's okay to say, like, I am confused and concerned too. Right. And like, I think there's a lot of value in letting kids kind of see that. And, obviously, I don't want parents like sobbing to their kids about this and having kids take care of them, but like being honest and saying, this is something that's upsetting to me too. And we're going to figure that out together. And, this is a space to talk about that. Yeah. Some people who have really good resources just over the past couple of days that I've been looking at, I think the Childline Institute they always have awesome resources. I know they just posted an awesome couple articles, both about COVID and, talking to your kids about race. I think there were some awesome articles on there. Childlife.org had a few good ones. I think the CDC is always good for getting just some awesome, like, how to dispel these false rumors, right, for kids. Yeah. So those are all awesome ones that I've definitely found helpful, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's take our first question from Jennifer. In regards to trauma, if kids have experienced it, is there a class a parent can take to help their children? Or is there something that, is there a class that of course, parents can ask for if it's not currently being offered, or a parent
Yeah.
training series, session, anything you've heard of?
Yeah, that's a super, super awesome question, Jennifer. I definitely would have to dig a little bit deeper into this. I mean, there is so much out there in terms of kind of what you said at the beginning, right? This is like, this is a trending word right now, particularly in the space of both counseling and therapy and, parenting in general. I think some topics that I might look up, just in terms of resources, I think, again, the ones that I just listed, but I also think when I'm thinking about trauma in a larger space and thinking about kind of ways that I conceptualize it, I'd also look into adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. These are really awesome. It's a way of thinking about trauma in childhood. I mean, I can get deeper into it. I think it's something that I would definitely look up though. So adverse childhood experiences are, events that, we would perceive as traumatic for kids. Really kids between like 0 and 17 is what we're measuring. So, I mean, they'd be things that you would expect, right? It would be, abuse, physical, emotional, witnessing violence in their home, having a family member die, but also these kind of bigger rooted problems like community violence, bullying, parental separation, divorce, parents with mental health. And it's really all the research around ACEs has been, looking at how this impacts kids later down the line. And it is focusing a lot on racism and community violence as well. And so what they actually found through all this research, it's really, really, I mean, I think it's cool because I'm a trauma nerd, but it's not, I mean, it's not good news, but it's also good for us to think about is that, kids who later in life as adults, they had 4 or more of these ACEs is what they're called. They actually saw them having a harder time, and greater risk for a lot of things, such as like mental health issues, alcohol and drug abuse, all of these, like lack of employment, depression, all of these. And so helping us to kind of identify these early for kids. So I'd look into that as well. It's something really, really interesting.
Yeah, because I think I've been to some trauma training, for lack of a better word. Yep. And one of the most positive things I think to come out of it is that unlike some other disabilities, trauma can be healed, and you can heal from trauma, whereas you may not be able to necessarily heal or cure other things. So.
Yeah. And I know there's a question coming up here, but that brings up a really good point around just like post-traumatic growth too. I would look that up as well. I think that's something that makes me feel a lot better out of all of this. A lot of psychologists in like the 1990s were looking at like, hey, is there anything that comes out of, these traumatic events for kids? Is there anything good as kids? And what does that mean? And, they actually saw that like about like half, I think it was like a half to like 2/3 of, people who went through cancer treatment or, homelessness or all these things, they actually saw them really like thriving following these adverse, experiences. So that's definitely great to look at too. So post-traumatic growth, I think, makes me feel optimistic at least.
Yeah. Okay. 2 questions about some resources on healing trauma or resources for older kids.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think older kids are hitting this the hardest, right? I mean, you have some almost teenagers yourself there that it sounds like. And I mean, yeah, older kids are struggling right now. I think there's a lack of the social piece, which is so hard, right? Because we know teens really, really want to have these conversations with their friends and they're looking at a screen, right? I think it's, they're lacking that social piece, and that's so developmentally needed and appropriate for this age of friends. I think a couple things that I've been thinking about and working with a few of the older kids that I've been working with is really like the gratitude piece and acts of kindness. I think are really huge for this age group especially when they're more aware of what's going on, right? So I think for our older kids, finding a way that they can give back to the community, or, express some gratitude to help with that hopelessness and depression piece. Because what we know about gratitude is that it can actually, the more we practice it, the more it switches our brain to feeling happiness, right? And that we're able to kind of process this. And so I think for our older kids, I've said a lot of like, I ran a group the other day around like writing some thank you cards for some of the people who work in hospitals, leaving some signs out for, food delivery, post office, UPS, all these people to kind of be able to express some gratitude, feel like we have some control. I also think for our teen friends, it's all about the education piece again, right? So it's having conversations, it's allowing space for us to talk about these heavy, heavy topics and ask questions and not be afraid to say, I don't know the answer, but let's think about it together. Those are all really important things.
Yeah. And I think it's important, you might think that teens or tweens, whatever, that they're not maybe even talking about this. But what I've realized is, we only let my son have an Instagram account. That's the only social media that he has. But he follows a lot of NBA and NFL players because that's his jam, is that he likes sports. And, all the NBA and NFL players are talking about this. So while he may not be talking about it with his friends, he is certainly being exposed to it, frequently from them. So,
and I think, and the thing that's cool about it, and we can draw a lot from it, is that, there are people talking about it, right? So what questions do you have about those people? What questions do you have about yourself? Like, I think being open to that piece and having a conversation and educating yourself a lot beforehand, right? I think is the important piece. So that you feel comfortable. Because I know for a lot of parents, this isn't comfortable, right? And a lot of educators, like, we don't know where we stand on it, or we don't know how to talk about it and feel good. So doing some soul searching before that and, making sure we feel good about that. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about some kids who may have some specific issues that maybe make them not receptive to adult guidance or adult suggestions, specifically if they have something like ODD.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Yeah, and so I can tell you up front, that is one of the many reasons that I work at My Dear. A lot of our research has been specifically around ODD and helping these kiddos, because I think particularly for our friends with ODD, a lot of it is around choice and option, right? So I think
is ODD, can it be like a byproduct of trauma?
I think we see some oppositional behaviors come out of trauma, right? I think it's a really, really good question. The symptoms that come out of trauma can be different for everybody, right? So we have our friends that come out of traumatic events with a lot of anxiety and fear. We have a lot of friends that come out with hopelessness and, more depression. We have a lot of friends that come out with some angry and frustrated and some oppositional feelings. And I think, which are often tied to anxiety, depression, things like that underneath. And I think for, my experience working with kids who tend to be more oppositional, it's giving them a lot of choice and a lot of options. So I think, saying to those kiddos, there's a few options here of things that you can do. We're going to work on, deep breathing or mindfulness today. Here are some choices, right? So we can use this book and it talks about breathe like a bear. We can, do our mindfulness. One of my favorite mindfulness games is looking around a room, finding something of every color in the rainbow, or a letter, an object that starts with every letter. Giving them options and maybe even like helping these kids to create like a menu of choices of skills that they can use can be really, really helpful, because often what we find is if it's if we tell them something to do, it's going to be the exact opposite. So we kind of have to do some reverse psychology and create a lot of options and autonomy there.
Okay. Okay. So let's do this one, because I know it's on everybody's mind. Screen time.
Yeah.
Right. We've been berated as parents about too much screen time. And now here we are. We've been stuck in the house for 81 days.
Yes. I love your countdown on there.
Yeah.
So reality for me.
Yeah. So we've been stuck in the house for 81 days and our kids are on screens. How do we reconcile the two?
Yeah. And I think the screen time debate it's a great question. And it is something that as adults, right? I can pull up right here. I had to buy blue light glasses because this is the first time in my life that I've looked at a computer for this many hours and it is impacting us in a variety of different ways. I think we're what I like to think of in terms of screen time is it kind of as like an old fashioned food pyramid, right? So like we have our, at the bottom, we have our like leafy greens, right? Of like, these are educational things. This is distant learning. This is our school lessons. This is educational software. We have our like in between, like maybe our like tasty fruits, right? So like these are some, this is where I kind of see the social interactions piece, right? It's providing some good. However, kids are kind of accessing it, whether it's through video games, whether it's through like other platforms or, Zoom. And then we have our like junk food at the top, which is our like, where we're playing games that are not helping us in any way, right? They're not connecting us socially. They're not, providing us any educational value. And so when I talk to parents about screen time, I always say like, we want a balance, right? Like, especially nowadays, this is hard. But finding a balance between, this educational piece that we need to do, this foundational piece, having them, pick and choose when they can kind of get those yummy fruits, those conversations with their friends, and limiting, some of those other things that like first person shooter games and those things that aren't necessarily helping us. And finding that balance can be a good way to kind of navigate this. I think the reality is like, we know we feel better in our brain and our body when we move. And it's hard to do right now, especially if we are really locked down like we are in Boston. I mean, it's a stay-at-home order, right? We're not going outside. We're not playing with friends. And so finding ways to find movement however we can. I mean, a lot of families that I speak with are, in 2-bedroom apartments like myself, and we're doing obstacle courses with kids and we're doing at-home workouts. I think my go-to is always Go Noodle. I think, I'm sure you've heard of it. It's fabulous. Yeah. There's so much, it's a good break between the day, if we're doing a lot of screen time just to get our bodies moving. And really like, I think having conversations with kids about how they feel after screens and before screens. I think a lot of kids are honest of like, I am so sick of looking at a computer. I had a kid the other day on the phone say like, at least my mom gets to go to work, right? Because she's a nurse. She's like, I know it stinks, but like at least she gets to go because like I hate looking at this computer. So having kids identify that and identify what they feel in their bodies before and after, what they feel in their bodies before and after exercise. Like I think we can create some really awesome conversations and habits from having those conversations that can be really beneficial. So,
okay. Yeah. I had one person posted that they can't hear us. So if a couple of you could, I just want to make sure if it's just one person or a whole bunch, can you hear us?
No.
Before I do another question.
Let's hope.
I know. The fact that no one's like saying anything makes me concerned. Anyone? Can you hear us? And I really can't believe how dark it is here.
I can hear you. Great.
Okay.
Guys.
Okay, good. All right, then we're going to keep going.
Let's keep going.
Okay, resources needed for a 5-year-old dealing with divorce.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I'm just reading the question.
Yep, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think, now all these I can hear you comments are coming in. Sorry,
okay,
I got nervous. They had to stop. Yeah, so this is a super good question, Lisa. I think I'm witnessing trauma bonding at this moment with the child. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think you being aware that this is something that's really hard for you right now is an awesome place to be at, because I think we need some awareness around that. And that's great. I think oftentimes when I'm talking about this and when we think about trauma and building resiliency, one of the major things, and talking about resiliency in general, right? I think, and there's a lot of research out of Harvard. This is not my idea, but if we think about building resiliency, it's on like one of those old fashioned like weights or like seesaws. And so on one side we have like the negative experiences, right? So like, for example, in this scenario, like the negative experiences of a divorce, like, there's, lack of routine, there's difficulty, with managing who has custody, who does not, change in location, school, all that stuff is like kind of this negative piece. The positive experience is like, hey, this could feel a lot better for you. This could feel a lot better for your family, your mental health. And so if we have the kid in the middle, right, on this kind of like fulcrum, this is hard to do with my hands. Typically drawing. But if we think of kids as kind of like that middle point, we have kids kind of like on a spectrum, and that fulcrum kind of moves. So with their own resiliency. And we kind of like want to balance out these negative and positive experiences so that they're able to move forward and build this resiliency piece. And what we know about kids is when we're trying to build resiliency, is the way to do this is kind of through some really, really positive interactions. And that's something a lot of the research out of Harvard, when they're talking about resiliency, is these positive bonding moments. And it's something that, is really, really helpful in terms of increasing that positive experience load on that seesaw. It's really, really helpful for them to be able to, kind of unburden themselves from the negative experiences. So in terms of, creating those experiences and that positive relationship, I mean, I don't know how old this kiddo is, but I think it's a really, really good place to start, is trying to figure out ways that you can kind of bond with them and figuring out that piece. I think, developmentally, if that's younger kids, it means, spending a lot of time in pretend play. It's spending a lot of time with them, doing things that they prefer to do through play. If it's older kids, it's having a lot of bigger conversations, maybe, going out, playing sports, doing things together and trying to build that relationship, because we know that is such a foundational part of that resiliency piece. And so, definitely if you want some more info on that too, feel free to chat us, just in terms of, if it's an older kiddo or younger kiddo, but.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So what can we do for kids in this moment with COVID-19, with the riots, with all of it, to kind of, if there is anything, to minimize the impact and minimize the effects of trauma or anxiety, or help build resilience, whatever that may be?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot we can do. I think the good news is, well, a couple things, right? I think, one, nothing like this has happened to kids all over the world, right? Like, we know that kids are losing a lot right now, and they're losing education, they're losing relationships. I mean, it's unprecedented, right? So the reality is, if we're looking at this from, a scientific standpoint of like, we know kids are going to come out of this fine, like, we don't, right? We don't know, like, we don't have any research on this. But what we know, and what I was talking about earlier, just in terms of post-traumatic growth, I think what we know is that kids can be resilient and kids can come out of this with a lot of growth. My hope, and what I hear from kids often talking to them, is an understanding of, different things that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise, right? So we have a lot of understanding and a lot of appreciation for things that maybe we didn't appreciate earlier. And although it is scary for kids, I think it's really, really great for kids to be able to experience this and be able to have this experience in a positive way. I think when we're thinking about how to make that the most positive, right, there's a lot of things that we can do. Again, taking care of ourselves first as adults. I think the education piece of, dispelling rumors and making sure that they feel educated and that they know that we're trying to keep them safe. I know a lot of the work that we've been doing with our younger friends is just literally talking about our own body safety, right? So like how to wash our hands, how to cover our mouths, like things that we are actually concretely doing. We wear masks when we go outside. Like, I think kids are flexible and resilient. Like they understand and they are able to conquer that, maybe even a little bit better than adults who this is a little bit more scary for. So I think education is a huge piece. I think practicing different skills, kind of like what we talked about when we were talking about our friend with ODD, right? Like giving kids an option board or an option list or conversations around different skills that can be helpful. So whether it's deep breathing, whether or not it's different grounding and mindfulness things, I mean, it doesn't even have to be things that are labeled as like, therapeutic, right? It can be, I have a kid that I work with often who just like rips paper, and that's his coping skill. And he has a corner of like recycled mail where he just sits and rips whenever he's having a tough time. And that's what works, right? So I think it's having conversations with kids around, it's okay to not feel great right now, but it's, here's some things that we can use, and modeling for yourself what's useful, right? So, when I'm having a tough time focusing and I need to kind of take a brain break, I paint my nails because it's something we can focus on. It's great.
Right.
We're going to give an example.
Right.
So I think it's giving a lot of examples like that too.
Right. Okay. So a question from Olga about some anxiety and kids with anxiety. And this has been coming up a lot. And I would like to add to her question that we've been hearing from a lot of parents, not just kids with anxiety, but kids maybe who struggle socially, kids who have bullying issues, all this stuff, and all the demands that they normally deal with have been removed. So they're actually thriving right now.
A lot of friends thriving.
Right. We have a lot of people thriving right now, and it's going to be an issue when they go back. And then, of course, there's the what ifs, like, do we think the anxiety is going to be worse, or, what are some things that we want to put in place? And I'd like to add, one more, that when Olga says, what can we ask from their schools and districts? Of course you can ask for anything if it's based on child's needs. But an interesting point was brought up. I had a clinical psychologist on, I want to say 2 weeks ago, who specializes in OCD and anxiety. And he just wanted to reiterate that you don't want to feed the anxiety. And I think that that's something that comes up a lot with parents with IEPs and 504s, particularly with anxiety.
Yes, absolutely.
That it's, okay, well, this makes him anxious, so we remove that. And we can't go through life kind of snow plowing and removing triggers from kids because, rather than giving them coping mechanisms. So, anyway, I just want to keep that on your radar, parents, as you are thinking about what you're going to ask for.
Yeah. And I mean, yes, multiple things here. So I think, one, we do see so many kids thriving right now. I think what's fascinating is, I've heard from, several of my friends are teachers just after working in school districts around, we see a lot of kids like thriving in ways that we haven't seen them thrive educationally and socially kind of through this digital platform. And I think what's fascinating to me is, like, as an adult, right, we know people who work from home and how they do that and how that works well. And, we have folks who go into an office every day and really thrive in that way. And I think what I find interesting about this is, like, we've had an opportunity to learn a lot about our kids, right? And what is a huge trigger for them? What is challenging? What is something that we can work on kind of moving forward? So, I mean, one example that comes to mind is, a mom that talked to me the other day who said, she was like, yeah, I mean, he's doing great. And, he struggled with talking to peers in the classroom, but online he's talking to everybody, right? In the Google chat, they can't get him to stop talking, and she's like, it's amazing that, like, we had a really heart-to-heart conversation around, like, why do you think that is? Do you notice this as a change in yourself? And he was able to say, like, I get nervous about, he has a speech impairment. And, like, he's like, I get nervous about talking in front of people. Right. And she had such a great perspective around it. And she said to me, she was like, we would have never had that conversation and been able to really think that through if this hadn't been the case. Right. So I see so much optimism for parents around, like, this is what this gave me. But I mean, if we're thinking bigger for kids and families who struggle with this, like, I think the psychologist is right. Like, we can't, the worst thing that we can do is kind of feed into, these kids and taking away all these worries, right? And it's ultimately, this is not something that we can control right now, right? We're not going to be able to control whether, what happens in September, if and when we go back. But I think what we can do is use this time to really practice skills, like practice, starting for a lot of these kids, we don't have an opportunity to kind of practice skills when they are calm, right? What we know is, like, helping kids to practice when they are not escalated. Actually, we get a lot of benefit from that because they're able to really, practice skills and feel more confident. So using this time to have these really fruitful conversations like that mom had with her son, having these opportunities to practice these skills now and prep for what is to come, right? And know that, like, we practice all these things and we're going to go into this stronger because we've had this kind of natural pause, if that kind of makes sense. Because I think it is helpful to kind of, reflect on that and notice some different triggers that maybe we weren't able to see in the past.
Yeah. And I think with clients, one of a great coping mechanism that I've seen that I don't know if it's used often enough is that, this feeling will pass. And I think that when we see our kids in distress, it's natural to want to just stop it and stop feeling that way. And let me remove that trigger and this antecedent or whatever it is. Let me remove whatever it is that's making you feel this way, because I just want this to stop, because I want you to not be in distress, rather than, it's okay to not feel okay.
Yep.
And this feeling is going to pass.
Yep. Absolutely. And I mean, and that's what we know about, OCD and anxiety in general, right? I tell kids we kind of have to lean in order to make sure that we're able to make it out, right? And we're here with you, and this is a really good spot to practice with people that we love, right? We're with our families, and it's a good place to practice that. So it's a great point.
Kelly, I'm assuming that Kelly is some kind of teacher, even though she hasn't said so, but ideas for online positive bonding. I'm assuming that she's not doing online bonding with her kids. So I'm going to assume that she's a teacher or therapist of some kind that is worried about if we have to go back to online in the fall or the winter or whatever. We don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really, really, really good question, especially our bigger friends. I mean, and our older friends. I think it's a super good question. I'd have to look more into this just because this hasn't been a space that I've been frequently in. So I think what I can say is my fingers are crossed that we're providing a space for that. I have heard several schools, and if you are a teacher at whatever level, I'm interested. Oh, maybe she just responded.
Oops. Hold on, where'd it go? Here we go.
Yep.
That one?
Yep. I think she just commented that she's an intervention specialist. Yeah.
Oh,
so
okay.
What I have seen some schools do is provide like small group social interactions, like through Google Classroom or whatever platform you're kind of using. So one school I work with in particular, they have like social Fridays where they kind of split up into like 5 rotating groups, and they just have kids, they have kind of like restorative justice circles, like conversation starters. I mean, these kids know each other, right? A lot of them have grown up together. I think this is a really good opportunity to like have a topic to talk about and like provide a space to do that. Another really awesome thing that I saw recently, and it might not be as relevant to you, but I think you sound like a creative person, so this might be cool, is there's a lot of really cool websites now that are helping to build like, I've seen it for art classes specifically, like boards with sharing kind of like art and, things that they've been working on, like on a website format. And so I know for like a lot of kids, helping them to kind of express themselves and post things, and whether it be like, you create a board of like funny things to share, or like things that we've been working on. Like, I think anything that we can kind of help to make that more normalized is great. But I'm going to have to look into that more because that's a really, really good question.
Okay. Yeah. And she says, it's one thing to help a child once you already know them. But what if we end up starting school this way in the fall? Like, we don't, God, I hope not.
I know.
But I mean, yes, it's I know it's a very real possibility, particularly for those of us near larger cities.
Yeah. And it's valid. And thinking about, being mindful that like kids are coming into that too, right? So like we're anxious about that as adults, but like these kids are coming into a virtual world where we want to make sure we're really talking to them and setting some individual time away to talk to them, because they're coming in and not knowing anybody, right? And it's a hard thing to walk into.
Jennifer, I'm going to skip over your question for now, and I will give you some contact information just because your question seems very super specific. So I'm going to pass over that. They don't want to go back. Yes, I know.
Yeah.
Let's see. That's not about trauma. Okay, I'm going to keep it focused on like trauma, COVID-19, and what we're dealing with, just kind of what our society is dealing with right now, since that's Emily's kind of wheelhouse, is social work and trauma, and not that. What does Aaron say? This appears more for parents helping their kids. Oh yeah, this is definitely for parents. My audience tends to be about 95, 96% female. So it's moms with kids with a disability of some kind because they have an IEP or 504. Is there any virtual discussion group meant for kids? Not that I know of.
No, I mean, there might be, right? There might be more than I'm thinking of. We've been doing a lot of that through Mighty Year just for our kiddos and just having some more open conversations around that. But it is something that I've been thinking a lot about and like that somebody needs to do. I would love to be that person. If we find places, I'll be sure to send them your way too, because I think, I think our hope is that this isn't going to last forever and that we don't need this. But at the same time, like this might be something as we're going into the fall to make sure we're talking with kids about and making sure they have resources too. So
right. And I yesterday I did an interview with a friend who's a minister and a teacher, and we talked about race relations. Of course, it had to be very brief. It was very last minute. But he mentioned a couple of movies. People who are following mentioned a couple of movies, and I found a couple of book lists from like embracerace.org, I think, and things like that. But yeah, there seems to be a lot of books, but not necessarily actual engagement,
Yeah. If I find anything, I will honestly send it your way because it is so important.
Okay, let's see. Special ed teacher in a private school, you write 504s. Where can I find COVID-19 related accommodations?
That's a good question.
I published some, but I think it's still going to be based on needs, and it's still going to be based on what does the child need. And I think, I'm trying to think of which chat it was. I think when I had Jamie Bassman on, who's an OT, she talked about some, and you just have to think about what's changed as far as demands, what's changed as far as environment, and how the child is affected that way.
Yep. Yeah.
So, but I will look that up and I'll include it in the recap when I send this out.
Yeah. I mean, that I think I found that the most tricky part too is hearing from these kids like, I miss my OT, I miss my teacher, I miss my therapist. Like it is, just being somebody who does a lot of play-based therapy, it is so hard to do over the computer, and these kids, miss you guys, and it's hard. So thinking really creatively.
Yeah. Okay. And Christy says that she knows of several Facebook support group pages for parents who have children who have been through trauma. And I'm sure, yeah
absolutely.
And I think you just have to find a good fit there,
Yep. And it's all very like, finding a good fit and finding stuff that feels right for you. I think there's a lot of different ways to think about trauma and making sure that it feels good and something that feels good for you and your kid. I think.
Right. Because there's different, I have a lot of parents in our group, in my Facebook group, who they've either adopted or they're fostering kids, and that's a different set of issues as compared to a divorce and living with one parent. And so, but I think that there's a lot out there.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're at almost 1:00. So you want to wrap up? Do you want to tell us a little bit, anything, any final thoughts, anything you want to say about Mighty Year and what that has to offer as far as this situation? And
I mean, absolutely. I think, ultimately it's been super, super great to, interact with all you guys, at least virtually. And please reach out if you ever need anything. It's been awesome to kind of talk about educating our kids on these, really, really intense and big things for even adults to be dealing with. So, I mean, also kudos to everybody here for being here, trying our best to figure out, what's going on and how to make sense of it for ourselves as adults so that we can help a lot of our little friends. Cause I think that's important. And if you ever want to learn anything else about Mighty Year, so again, we are a biofeedback video game platform. So a lot of the work that I have been doing in the past couple months has been around, continuing to help these kids develop coping skills to really manage these big feelings that we see. Particularly our friends that are talking about, diagnoses of ODD, ADHD, anxiety. What we really focus on with Mighty Year is creating muscle memory so that these skills are easier. So we have a lot of kids who walk around with really robust toolboxes of all these coping skills, but can't use them in the moment. So what we are trying to do, and, what has been backed by research out of Boston Children's and Harvard Medical School is that kids are able to use these skills more easily after practice. So that is us. And we, let us know what you need and any information.
Can I ask you, sorry, one last question? As IEP parents or 504 parents, I think we do get in tune with our kids, and looking for different behaviors, looking for things that might change. For those parents who might be watching who maybe don't have a child with an identified disability right now, what are some maybe subtle things that you may not notice that your child has been affected by this shutdown or the stress of the pandemic or the stress of what they're seeing on TV, stress of what may be going on in their neighborhood or town? What are some subtler signs that might be missed? Signs of stress or distress?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think it's good to clue into it now, but also clue in, a few months down the line as well. Because what we know about a lot of kids is that they're shutting a lot of this out and, just being really mindful about later on what turns up too. In terms of anxiety and for kids that maybe haven't experienced this before, like, trouble leaving the house, more conversations around like illness and death and concerns around that, some more of those like somatic symptoms. So body cues of like, my stomach hurts, I'm nauseous, I have a headache, I don't want to eat, things like that really can cue us into some anxiety, difficulty sleeping. In terms of like depression and like hopelessness symptoms. So like, there's a lot going on in terms of missing big events and, some isolation. So like difficulty getting up in the morning, a lot of kids crying really frequently, having, a lack of interest in activities and exercise, isolating from friendships. I've seen that from a lot of kids. Like, I don't really want to talk to my friends today. Right. And so if that's different, cueing into that, and some of those oppositional pieces of like refusing to do some tasks, refusing to do work, some frequent like fights, nitpicking with siblings, caregivers. I think those are all things to look out for and, not to panic about, but like, there's something incredibly wrong, but just noting those and noting changes, I think is important.
Okay. And one last question from a viewer: does insurance cover your program?
Super great question. We're in the process. Fingers are crossed. We're doing quite a few different things here. Right now, no, but definitely keep an eye out and check on our website, and we're happy to kind of talk with people. So,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Again, for those of you, if you are just tuning in, which I think some people said they were, this will be on the Facebook page. You can watch the replay. I send it out in email. It'll be on YouTube. Yes, it's here. It's live. It's live now, but it will be there for all of eternity, for as long as Facebook exists.
I will be here forever.
Yes.
Honestly, if anybody needs anything, always feel free to reach out. And it was so nice to meet everybody and to have this conversation with you today. It was great.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Bye.